The concept of an independent Palestinian state is a powerful one. Wide establishing shot of UN headquarters with diplomatic vehicles arriving. It's been at the center of international diplomacy for decades, you know? At its core, it means the creation of a sovereign nation for the Palestinian people. Medium shot of Palestinian legislative building exterior with officials entering. Wide shot of modern courtroom with judges' bench and legal proceedings. This new country would have its own government, its own laws, and its own borders. It would stand on the world stage as an equal among other nations. The idea is simple to state, but honestly, it's incredibly complex to achieve. It involves ending the long-standing Israeli occupation, territories captured back in 1967, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip. For millions of Palestinians, this isn't just a political goal. It's the hope for self-determination, for an end to displacement, and for a chance to build their own future on their own land. This vision of statehood is formally known as the two-state solution. It's been supported, at least in principle, by the United Nations, the United States, and many other global powers. The goal? An independent state of Palestine existing peacefully alongside the state of Israel. This would require drawing final borders, often proposed along the 1967 lines with some land swaps. It would also need to resolve incredibly difficult issues, including the status of Jerusalem. Another key issue, the right of return for Palestinian refugees displaced in past conflicts. For the average Palestinian, the establishment of an independent state holds the promise of a profoundly different life. Statehood would mean having a government that can make its own economic policies. It could build infrastructure, manage its own resources, seek foreign investment. Aerial view of a smooth new highway cutting through rural landscape, clear skies, steady drone move. Medium shot of a new school building with children entering, bright morning light, welcoming architecture. Imagine new roads, schools, hospitals built based on the needs of the Palestinian people. A Palestinian state could create its own currency, establish a central bank, engage with institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. This could unlock enormous potential for economic growth, creating jobs and opportunities, especially for the young and educated population. The social fabric of Palestinian society could also be transformed. Medium shot of judges in a formal courtroom, authoritative composition, and soft interior lighting. Wide shot of a modern university campus with students moving between buildings, bright academic environment. With sovereignty, Palestinians would have control over their own legal system, control over their own educational system. They could build institutions reflecting their culture, their history, and their aspirations. The feeling of dignity that comes with having your own passport, your own national anthem. A flag that flies at the United Nations is hard to overstate. It would represent a shift from being a people defined by conflict and occupation to a nation defined by its own achievements. This psychological boost could unleash a wave of creativity and innovation in arts, science, and business. It would allow Palestinians to focus their energy on building a society rather than resisting an occupation. Consider the practical changes to daily life. A Palestinian family could travel from Jenin to Hebron without needing permits. Goods could move freely within the state's borders, lowering costs for businesses and consumers. A sovereign Palestine would control its own borders and points of entry, managing the flow of people and goods. This freedom of movement would reconnect communities, strengthen family ties. It would create a more unified and integrated national economy. The creation of a Palestinian state could fundamentally reset diplomatic relations across the Middle East. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has long been a source of tension and a rallying cry that has shaped politics from Morocco to Iran. For decades, many Arab nations refused to normalize relations with Israel until the Palestinian issue was resolved. While some countries have moved forward with agreements like the Abraham Accords, the conflict remains a major obstacle to broader regional integration. The establishment of a sovereign Palestine, based on a negotiated agreement with Israel, could remove this central barrier. It could pave the way for full diplomatic recognition of Israel by more Muslim-majority countries, creating a more stable and interconnected Middle East. This new diplomatic landscape could foster unprecedented cooperation on shared challenges. Wide shot of arid landscape highlighting water scarcity. Aerial view of dust storm and visible climate impacts. The region faces pressing issues like water scarcity, climate change, economic instability that do not respect national borders. With the core conflict resolved, countries like Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Egypt could work together more openly and effectively. Imagine joint projects on desalination or a regional energy grid that promotes green technology. Resolving the Israeli-Palestinian issue would allow leaders to redirect political capital and resources away from conflict management and toward building a more prosperous future for all their citizens. For Israel, a negotiated two-state solution would bring the promise of long-term security and legitimacy in the region. While many Israelis have deep security concerns, a stable and viable Palestinian state as a neighbor could be preferable to the indefinite occupation of millions of Palestinians. An end to the conflict would mean an end to the international condemnation and isolation that Israel has often faced. It would allow Israel to integrate more fully into the region's economy and culture. Ultimately, a lasting peace with the Palestinians is seen by many as the only way for Israel to secure its future, as both a Jewish and a democratic state. The path to a new dawn for diplomacy is promising, but it would require careful navigation and genuine commitment to coexistence from all parties involved. The emergence of a sovereign Palestinian state would send ripples far beyond the Middle East, reshaping global politics and trade relationships. For decades, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been a persistent and often divisive issue at the United Nations and in other international forums. It has strained alliances, particularly between the United States, European partners, and Arab partners. A resolution to this conflict would remove a major point of friction in global diplomacy. It would allow the international community to focus its collective energy on other pressing global challenges such as climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation. Economically, a stable and independent Palestine could become a new hub for trade and for investment. With a strategic location connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe, Palestine could develop its own ports, trade routes, and logistics infrastructure. International companies that may have been hesitant to invest in the region due to political instability might see new opportunities. A peace agreement would likely be followed by a significant international aid and investment package. This influx of capital could create a domino effect, boosting the economies of neighboring countries like Jordan, Egypt, as trade and tourism flourish across newly opened borders. The resolution of the conflict would also have a profound impact on the relationship between the West and the Muslim world. The plight of the Palestinians has been a source of deep anger and resentment for many Muslims globally. It has often been used by extremist groups as a powerful recruiting tool to fuel anti-Western sentiment. The creation of a Palestinian state could help to undermine this narrative. It could be seen as the West, particularly the United States, fulfilling its stated commitment to justice and self-determination. This could lead to improved relations, greater cooperation on counterterrorism efforts, and a reduction in the ideological fuel that powers global extremist movements. For major world powers, the new geopolitical map would require a recalibration of their strategies. The United States has long been the primary mediator in the conflict. With a resolution, U.S. foreign policy in the region could shift from crisis management to fostering long-term strategic partnerships. Other powers, like the European Union, Russia, and China, would also seek to build strong ties with the new Palestinian state. This could create a new diplomatic arena where global powers compete for influence through investment, trade, and cultural exchange, rather than through proxy conflicts. The birth of a new nation would create a new player on the global chessboard, altering alliances and creating new dynamics for years to come. While the dream of independence is, incredibly powerful, the reality of building a state from the ground up is actually fraught with immense challenges. One of the most significant risks here is the potential for internal instability. Palestinian society isn't monolithic. It has some pretty deep political divisions. Fatah, which governs the West Bank, Hamas, which has controlled Gaza. Forging a unified and effective government from these rival factions would be a truly monumental task. If these divisions aren't healed, a new Palestinian state could, unfortunately, be born right into a state of internal conflict. A weak or fractured government would really struggle to provide basic services. It would struggle to maintain law and order. It could fail to control its own security forces. That could potentially lead to a failed state scenario right at Israel's doorstep. The challenge of establishing democratic institutions is honestly Another major hurdle. Building a functioning democracy takes a lot more than just holding elections. Medium exterior shot of courthouse with judges at work inside. Medium shot of a busy newsroom with journalists filming and reporting. It requires a strong and independent judiciary. It requires a free press. It requires respect for human rights and a political culture that embraces pluralism. After decades of occupation and internal strife, these democratic norms just aren't deeply entrenched. There's a real danger that a new state could fall into authoritarianism, corruption, or even rule by militias. Economic viability is, honestly, another source of great concern. A new Palestinian state would likely be heavily dependent on foreign aid for many years. Its economy has been stunted by decades of restrictions. It lacks significant natural resources. Creating enough jobs for a young and growing population would be a massive undertaking. If the government fails to deliver economic prosperity and opportunity, public frustration could easily boil over into unrest. Furthermore, the question of armed groups presents a serious security dilemma. Hamas currently maintains its own armed wing. A sovereign state just can't tolerate private armies operating within its borders. Disarming these groups would be extremely difficult and potentially violent. Even if an agreement to create a Palestinian state is reached, some of the most difficult issues would remain. The question of final borders is a prime example. The generally accepted framework is a state based on the 1967 lines, but the reality on the ground is far more complex. Decades of Israeli settlement construction in the West Bank mean that simply drawing a line on a map is not feasible. Any agreement would likely require complex and emotionally charged land swaps, where Israel would annex some settlement blocks and compensate the Palestinians with land from within Israel proper. Agreeing on the size, location, and value of these swaps would be an incredibly contentious process, with the potential to derail negotiations at any moment. The status of Jerusalem is perhaps the single most explosive issue. Both Israelis and Palestinians have profound religious, historical, and national attachments to the city. Palestinians envision East Jerusalem as the capital of their future state, while Israel considers the entire city its eternal and undivided capital. Finding a compromise that satisfies both sides seems almost impossible. Dividing the city, creating a special international zone for the holy sites, having two capitals within one open city. Any solution would be met with fierce opposition from hardliners on both sides, who view any compromise on Jerusalem as a betrayal of their national and religious identity. Control over natural resources, particularly water, is another critical point of contention. The region is arid, and water is a precious and strategic asset. Much of the water that serves both Israelis and Palestinians comes from the mountain aquifer, which lies beneath the West Bank. For decades, access to this water has been a source of dispute, with Palestinians arguing they do not receive a fair share. Finally, the issue of Palestinian refugees remains a deeply emotional and politically difficult challenge. Millions of Palestinians are refugees or descendants of refugees who were displaced during the 1948 and 1967 wars. The Palestinian leadership has long insisted on the right of return, the principle that these refugees should be able to return to their former homes. Finding a formula that is seen as just by Palestinians while being acceptable to Israel is a monumental diplomatic challenge. The path to a Palestinian state is not just blocked by practical challenges on the ground, it is also confronted by a formidable wall of political and diplomatic opposition. Within Israel, there is a powerful and politically influential segment of society that is deeply opposed to the creation of a Palestinian state. This opposition is rooted in a combination of security fears, religious beliefs, and nationalist ideology. Many Israelis believe that a Palestinian state in the West Bank, often referred to by the biblical names Judea and Samaria, would be a mortal threat. They fear it would become a launchpad for attacks, and that relinquishing control of the territory would be a grave security risk. This viewpoint is strongly represented in the Israeli government and military establishment. This internal Israeli opposition is not a fringe movement. It has been a dominant force in Israeli politics for many years. Political parties that advocate for expanding settlements and oppose a two-state solution have frequently been key partners in governing coalitions. For any Israeli prime minister, making the concessions necessary for a Palestinian state would require immense political courage and would likely trigger a severe domestic political crisis. They would face accusations of betraying national security and abandoning the biblical heartland. The settler movement, in particular, is a well-organized and determined political force that would actively resist any attempt to evacuate settlements, potentially leading to violent confrontations with the Israeli army. Opposition is not limited to Israel. Within the Palestinian community itself, there are groups that reject the two-state solution. Hardline factions like Hamas have historically called for the liberation of all of historic Palestine, which would mean the elimination of the State of Israel. While their official positions have sometimes shown flexibility, their core ideology remains a major obstacle to a negotiated peace based on two states. These groups view any compromise with Israel as a betrayal of the Palestinian cause. Their ability to launch attacks and disrupt the peace process gives them a powerful veto. On the international stage, while many countries officially support a two-state solution, the level of active and unified pressure required to achieve it has often been lacking. Global powers have competing interests in the region, and their focus can shift due to other crises. Without sustained and unified international pressure on both parties to make difficult compromises, the political will to overcome domestic opposition is unlikely to materialize. The creation of a new Palestinian state would introduce a host of complex security dilemmas for the entire region. For Israel, the primary concern would be preventing the new state from becoming a security threat. Israeli leaders would demand stringent security arrangements to ensure that Palestine is demilitarized, to prevent it from acquiring heavy weaponry. They would likely insist on maintaining some form of security presence along the Jordan Valley on the border between the West Bank and Jordan to prevent smuggling of weapons. They would also want intelligence sharing agreements and assurances the new Palestinian government will crack down on terrorist groups. These demands could be seen by Palestinians as infringements on their sovereignty. From the Palestinian perspective, security means something very different. Security from Israeli military incursions. Security from the actions of Israeli settlers. A sovereign Palestinian state would need its own strong professional security forces to maintain law and order and to protect its borders. They would resist arrangements allowing the Israeli military to operate freely inside their territory because that would make their independence feel incomplete. Balancing Israel's need for security with Palestine's demand for sovereignty would be one of the most delicate parts of any final agreement. Failure to get this balance right could sow the seeds of future conflict, creating a fragile peace that could shatter at the first sign of trouble. The stability of neighboring countries would also be impacted, particularly Jordan and Egypt. Jordan has a large Palestinian population and shares a long border with the West Bank. Instability could easily spill over into Jordan, threatening its internal stability. Similarly, Egypt shares a border with Gaza and has been deeply involved in mediating between Palestinian factions and Israel. Beyond immediate neighbors, the rise of a Palestinian state could alter the regional balance of power. The new state would be drawn into the broader regional rivalry between Iran and its allies, and Sunni Arab states aligned with the West. Different powers would compete for influence over the new government in Ramallah and in Gaza. The security of the entire Middle East would hinge on the new state's ability to navigate these treacherous geopolitical waters. In the final analysis, the establishment of an independent state of Palestine would be a world-altering event, carrying with it both immense promise and considerable peril. The potential upside is transformative. It offers the prospect of ending one of the world's most enduring and painful conflicts, granting self-determination to millions of Palestinians, providing long-term security and regional acceptance for Israel. A resolution could unlock vast economic potential, foster a new era of diplomatic cooperation in the Middle East, remove a major source of global tension that has fueled extremism and strained international relations for generations. For a world weary of this conflict, a just and lasting peace would be a profound symbol of hope, proving that even the most intractable disputes can be resolved through diplomacy. However, the path to and beyond statehood is lined with daunting challenges and significant risks. The internal divisions within Palestinian society, the deep-seated opposition within Israel, and the sheer complexity of the final status issues, borders, Jerusalem, refugees, resources, could easily lead to failure. Even if a state is declared, there is no guarantee of its success. It could collapse into internal conflict, become an authoritarian regime, or fail to provide economic security for its people. Such a scenario would not only be a tragedy for Palestinians, but could also create a new and even more dangerous source of instability, potentially triggering wider conflicts that draw in neighboring countries and global powers. The global impact, therefore, is not a predetermined outcome. It hinges entirely on the how. A Palestinian state born from a negotiated, mutually agreed-upon settlement with Israel, supported by a unified international community, has the greatest chance of success. This state would need to be democratic, stable, and committed to peaceful coexistence. Ultimately, the question of a free Palestine forces the world to confront a fundamental choice. The outcome will shape the Middle East for the next century and will stand as a testament to the world's capacity for either conflict resolution or perpetual crisis.